That young man sitting over there is not my son.
The courtroom had already been tense for nearly an hour before anyone realized something was wrong with Harold Bennett. At first, it looked like exhaustion. The 78-year-old man sat hunched beside his court-appointed attorney, fingers trembling against the edge of the wooden table. His gray suit looked too large for him now, hanging loosely from shoulders that once spent decades repairing engines and lifting steel parts inside a mechanic's garage. Across the courtroom sat Daniel Bennett. Perfect posture, perfect suit, perfect calm. The 48-year-old real estate developer listened quietly while his attorney explained why the court should approve temporary control over Harold's finances, medical decisions, and property. The argument sounded reasonable. Harold had become forgetful, emotionally unstable, paranoid after the death of his wife. At least that was what Daniel claimed. And for most of the morning, the judge appeared willing to believe him. Until Harold suddenly stood up. Not slowly, abruptly. His chair scraped harshly across the courtroom floor. The sound forced several people to look up. Then Harold pointed directly at Daniel. His voice shook once before it hardened. "That man," he said quietly, "is not my son." The room froze. Even the judge stopped writing. Daniel didn't look shocked. That was the strange part. He looked angry. Not confused. Not hurt. Angry. His attorney immediately stood. "Your Honor, my client's father has suffered severe emotional decline since his wife passed away." "He knows exactly what he's saying," Harold interrupted. The judge leaned forward carefully. "Mr. Bennett, are you saying Daniel Bennett is not biologically related to you?" Harold swallowed hard. For a second, he almost looked like he regretted speaking. Then his eyes moved toward Daniel again. And something changed. Fear. Real fear. "He should never have found out," Harold whispered. Daniel suddenly pushed back his chair. "We need a recess." Too fast. Too sharp. The request cut through the room like panic disguised as authority. Judge Eleanor Hayes noticed it immediately. So did the court clerk standing near Harold. Because while everyone else watched Daniel, Harold was gripping an old photograph so tightly his hands had begun shaking uncontrollably. Judge Hayes asked for the photograph. Harold hesitated, then handed it over carefully. The picture itself looked ordinary. A young Margaret Bennett holding a newborn baby inside a hospital room. But on the back of the photograph, written in faded blue ink, were words that made the judge go silent. "The baby they gave us was never ours." And underneath that, a hospital name, a date, 1978. Before we go further, if you've been following stories like this on Chaos of Lives, let us know where you're watching from. And if you haven't already, take a moment to like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. The courtroom emptied for recess minutes later, but Judge Hayes remained seated, staring at the photograph. And through the glass doors outside the courtroom, she noticed Daniel Bennett arguing with Harold, not like a worried son, like a man trying to stop something before it destroyed him. By the time court resumed, the atmosphere had changed completely. What had started as a routine competency hearing no longer felt routine at all. Judge Hayes studied both men carefully. Daniel Bennett had built a reputation across the city as a disciplined businessman. Local newspapers praised him for restoring old neighborhoods through luxury redevelopment projects. He donated to charities, appeared at fundraisers, spoke confidently during interviews. From the outside, he looked successful, stable, controlled. But sitting in that courtroom, something about him felt rehearsed. Every answer arrived too smoothly. Every emotional reaction seemed measured before it happened. Meanwhile, Harold Bennett looked like a man carrying something heavy for far too long. His hands trembled constantly now, not from age, from pressure. Judge Hayes asked the first question carefully. "Mr. Bennett, why are you making this statement now?" Harold stared at the table for several seconds before answering. "Because Margaret's gone." His late wife. The name immediately shifted something inside the room. Daniel looked away for the first time all morning. Harold continued quietly. She made me promise never to say anything while she was alive. Daniel's attorney objected instantly, but Judge Hayes allowed Harold to continue. That was when Daniel spoke directly to his father for the first time. Please stop this. The words sounded calm, but underneath them sat something colder. A warning. Harold noticed it too. His breathing became uneven. Judge Hayes asked another question. When did you first suspect Daniel might not be your biological son? Harold closed his eyes briefly. Years ago. Daniel suddenly stood again. This is insane. But the judge noticed something strange. Daniel never once denied it. Not directly. Instead, he kept attacking Harold's mental state. That detail stayed with her. The court clerk then handed Judge Hayes a medical report submitted by Daniel's legal team weeks earlier. The report described Harold as paranoid, emotionally confused, prone to fabricated memories. But another document buried deeper inside the file changed everything. A nurse's statement from Harold's assisted living facility. It read, "Resident only becomes distressed after visits from son." Another line underneath had been highlighted. Resident repeatedly stated, "Don't let him take the house before I tell the truth." Judge Hayes slowly looked up from the paperwork. Daniel was already watching her, too carefully, and for the first time since proceedings began. The judge began wondering whether the wrong person had been called unstable. Nearly 48 years earlier, Harold and Margaret Bennett had believed their lives were finally beginning. They had spent years trying to have children, years of disappointment, miscarriages, silence. By the late 1970s, the pressure had nearly broken their marriage more than once. Margaret blamed herself constantly. Harold tried hiding how devastated he felt. Then finally, came Daniel. Born during a difficult overnight delivery inside St. Vincent Medical Center. Margaret cried the first time she held him. Harold remembered that moment clearly even now. She had whispered, "He's ours." And for many years, Harold believed that completely. Daniel grew up in a small blue-collar neighborhood on the edge of the city. Harold worked long hours repairing trucks while Margaret cleaned offices during evenings to help pay bills. Everything they earned went toward Daniel. Private tutoring, better schools, opportunities they never had. And Daniel was brilliant. Too brilliant sometimes. By high school, teachers described him as unusually intelligent but emotionally detached. Margaret dismissed the concerns immediately. "He's focused," she would say. But Harold noticed things Margaret refused to acknowledge. Daniel rarely showed affection naturally. Every emotional moment felt calculated. Even as a child, he learned how to become whoever people needed him to be. At 16, Daniel once lied convincingly about a teacher striking him. The accusation nearly ruined the man's career before surveillance footage exposed the truth. Margaret defended Daniel anyway. Always. Years later, small details began bothering Harold more seriously. A blood donation form listed a blood type that made no biological sense. A hospital bracelet Margaret had kept hidden suddenly disappeared. Whenever Harold tried discussing the inconsistencies, Margaret became emotional immediately. Too emotional. Finally, one night, she admitted something quietly. The night Daniel was born, their baby had briefly been taken from the room. Only for minutes. But Margaret never stopped thinking about it afterward. Harold wanted to investigate. Margaret refused. "We are not losing him after finally having him." So they buried it. Or tried to. As Daniel grew older, the emotional distance inside the family worsened. Success changed him quickly. Money changed him faster. By his 40s, Daniel controlled nearly every financial decision connected to the family, especially after Margaret became sick. At first, his attention looked caring. He attended appointments, handled paperwork, managed medications. But gradually Harold noticed something uncomfortable. Daniel spoke to doctors alone more often. Legal documents appeared unexpectedly. Margaret became quieter. And once, very late at night, Harold overheard his wife crying inside the kitchen. "She knows," Margaret whispered when she noticed him. Harold frowned. "Who?" Margaret immediately shook her head. "No one." But the fear in her face stayed with him. Then came the funeral. Rain covered the cemetery while Daniel stood beside grieving guests, shaking hands like a politician at a campaign event. Harold barely spoke that entire day. Later that night, Daniel entered Harold's garage while Harold sat alone near an old workbench. Inside the picture stood several nurses beside the maternity ward nursery in 1978. One face had been circled in red ink. A young doctor named Richard Vance. Evelyn spoke carefully. There was an incident that night. Judge Hayes leaned forward. Evelyn continued quietly. One baby stopped breathing. The judge's expression tightened. Whose baby? Evelyn swallowed hard. We were never told. According to Evelyn, panic spread through the maternity floor. Administrators locked down records temporarily. One wealthy family threatened lawsuits. Several nurses were ordered to stay silent. Then came the detail that changed everything. One infant disappeared from the nursery for nearly 20 minutes. Judge Hayes asked the question immediately. Was it Daniel Bennett? Evelyn looked shaken. I don't know. But the hesitation felt important. The retired nurse then admitted something else. Years later, she noticed portions of the hospital archive had been altered manually. Names rewritten. Timestamps adjusted. Signatures missing. Judge Hayes asked why she never reported it. Evelyn's eyes filled slowly with emotion. Because the doctor connected to the incident became very powerful. That sentence lingered heavily in the room. Especially when Evelyn revealed Richard Vance later became a senior medical director with political connections throughout the state. But before she could explain further, her phone suddenly rang. She glanced at the screen and immediately went pale. Judge Hayes noticed. Who is it? Evelyn declined the call instantly. No one. But her voice had changed. Fear again. Real fear. The meeting ended early. And 2 hours later, someone broke into Evelyn Mercer's home. Nothing valuable was taken. Not jewelry. Not money. Not electronics. Only one thing disappeared. A storage box containing old hospital documents. The police called it a burglary. Judge Hayes didn't believe that for a second. Neither did Harold. Because by then, Harold had finally gathered enough courage to review Margaret's hidden notes completely. And what he found terrified him. Margaret had hired a private investigator nearly 12 years earlier. The investigator believed Daniel may have discovered the truth long before anyone else. One handwritten note from Margaret read, "He asked questions no child should know to ask." Another said, "I think he found the blood records." But the final note disturbed Harold most. It was written only 3 months before Margaret died. The handwriting looked shaky, uneven, like someone writing while frightened. If anything happens to me suddenly, Harold needs to know Daniel already understands everything. Harold reread the sentence repeatedly. Then another memory returned suddenly. A conversation from years earlier. Margaret standing inside the kitchen late at night. Daniel entering unexpectedly. The instant she saw him, she stopped talking completely. At the time, Harold thought nothing of it. Now it felt horrifying. Because Margaret hadn't looked interrupted. She had looked caught. The next court hearing arrived under completely different tension. Reporters now waited outside the building. Rumors had spread quickly. Inside the courtroom, Daniel appeared composed again. But barely. Judge Hayes noticed small cracks immediately. Tighter jaw movements. Restless fingers. Impatience during testimony. And when Evelyn Mercer's name was mentioned, Daniel's entire posture stiffened. That reaction did not go unnoticed. Judge Hayes then addressed the courtroom carefully. After reviewing newly submitted evidence, she said, "This matter may extend beyond questions of competency." Silence spread instantly. The judge continued, "This court now has reason to consider potential fraud, identity concealment, and deliberate suppression of medical records." Daniel's attorney stood immediately. "This is outrageous." But Judge Hayes never looked away from Daniel. Because for the first time since proceedings began, Daniel Bennett looked genuinely afraid. And Harold finally realized something even worse than the original secret. Daniel wasn't afraid the truth would come out. He was afraid of what else might come with it. The courtroom felt different after that. No one spoke above a whisper anymore. Even the reporters waiting outside the building seemed quieter, as though the story had stopped feeling like gossip and started feeling dangerous. Judge Eleanor Hayes entered precisely at 9 the following morning, and before anyone could settle fully into their seats, she made the announcement. "This court is ordering immediate DNA testing." The words landed like a detonation. Daniel's attorney stood instantly. "We strongly object." "On what grounds?" Judge Hayes asked calmly. The attorney hesitated, and that hesitation mattered, because the objection sounded less like legal strategy and more like panic. Daniel remained seated, staring forward without expression. But beneath the table, his fingers tapped rapidly against his knee. Harold noticed. So did the judge. The hearing continued for another hour, but the emotional balance inside the courtroom had already shifted permanently. Daniel no longer looked like the confident son protecting an unstable father. He looked cornered, and cornered people made mistakes. That afternoon, Harold finally returned to the garage cabinet again. For years he avoided opening certain boxes because they reminded him too much of Margaret's final months. Now he forced himself to continue. Inside one sealed envelope, he found something unexpected, a receipt for private storage, dated only 6 months earlier. Harold stared at it in confusion. Margaret had been sick by then, weak, barely leaving the house. Yet somehow she had rented a storage unit without telling him. The discovery unsettled him immediately, especially because the key was still taped inside the envelope. By evening, Harold stood inside a dim storage facility on the edge of the city. Unit 214. The lock opened slowly. Inside sat only a few boxes, an old cassette recorder, and a large plastic container sealed tightly with tape. Harold's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside were decades of hidden pieces, medical forms, blood reports, old letters, photographs, investigator notes, newspaper clippings about St. Vincent Hospital, and underneath everything else, cassette tapes labeled in Margaret's handwriting. One was marked, "If Harold ever learns the truth." Harold nearly dropped it. An hour later, Judge Hayes sat alone inside her office while the tape recorder crackled softly between them. Margaret's voice emerged weak and uneven, but unmistakable. "I didn't know how to fix this anymore." Judge Hayes listened carefully. Margaret continued. "Daniel found out years ago." The judge froze. On the tape, Margaret explained that Daniel discovered inconsistencies in family medical records during his 30s. At first, he confronted her privately. Then obsessively, he demanded answers, demanded hospital records, demanded proof. Margaret admitted she panicked, not because she feared losing Daniel, but because she feared what the truth was turning him into. He stopped asking like a son, she whispered on the tape. He started asking like someone preparing for war. Judge Hayes felt a chill move through her. Margaret then revealed something even darker. After learning the truth, Daniel became obsessed with inheritance protections, trusts, properties, insurance policies. And during Margaret's cancer treatment, Daniel quietly inserted himself into nearly every financial decision. The tape paused briefly before Margaret spoke again. "If something happens to me sooner than expected, Harold needs to look closely at the medication changes." Judge Hayes slowly looked up. The implications settled heavily in the room. Not direct murder, but suspicion, possibility. And suddenly Margaret's death no longer felt emotionally simple. Meanwhile, across town, Daniel sat alone inside his luxury penthouse staring at city lights through massive glass windows. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from attorneys. He ignored all of them, because something else was unraveling inside him now. Not anger, fear, real fear. The kind that arrives when someone spends years controlling every possible outcome, only to realize the past cannot stay buried forever. A flashback surfaced in his mind. Him at 32 years old, standing inside Margaret's bedroom holding old blood records. Margaret crying quietly. Daniel asking one question repeatedly. "Who am I?" Not yelling, not emotional, just empty. Margaret never answered him directly, and maybe that had been the beginning of everything. The next court hearing became explosive before testimony even began. Judge Hayes requested Daniel approach the bench privately. The courtroom watched carefully as she handed him a typed transcript from Margaret's cassette recording. Daniel skimmed only 2 paragraphs before his expression changed completely. His calm disappeared. For the first time publicly, Daniel looked emotionally exposed. Judge Hayes spoke softly enough that only nearby attorneys could hear. "Did you know?" Daniel said nothing. The silence itself became an answer. The judge pressed further. When exactly did you learn you were not biologically related to Harold and Margaret Bennett? Daniel's jaw tightened. Still no answer. Then finally, years ago, the courtroom erupted instantly. Harold looked like he'd been physically struck. Even after suspecting it, he still wasn't prepared to hear Daniel admit it aloud. Daniel suddenly turned toward him, and decades of controlled behavior finally cracked open. You think this was easy for me? Daniel snapped. His voice echoed sharply through the courtroom. You think finding out your entire life was built on a lie doesn't destroy something inside you? Harold stared back in stunned silence. Daniel continued, louder now. You were my father when it mattered. She was my mother when it mattered. His breathing became uneven. But neither of you could stop treating me differently after you started suspecting the truth. That's not true, Harold whispered. Daniel laughed bitterly. It became true. The room fell silent again. Because underneath the manipulation, underneath the control, underneath the greed, sat something painfully human. Abandonment. Daniel's eyes filled unexpectedly. Not with grief. With rage buried beneath grief. You want to know the worst part? He said quietly. She kept pretending everything was normal even after she knew I knew. Harold looked devastated now. Daniel's voice dropped lower. She was afraid of me. No one spoke. Not even the attorneys. Then Daniel made the mistake that changed everything. I became the son they deserved after what they did. Judge Hayes narrowed her eyes immediately. What exactly did they do, Mr. Bennett? Daniel realized too late what he'd implied. But the damage was already done. Because suddenly the courtroom understood something horrifying. Daniel hadn't simply discovered the truth. He had spent years resenting them for it. And no one knew how far that resentment had gone. After Daniel's outburst, the courtroom remained silent long after Judge Hayes called for recess. Nobody moved immediately, because the case no longer felt like a legal dispute. It felt like the collapse of an entire family in real time. Harold sat motionless beside his attorney, staring at the empty witness stand where Daniel had been standing moments earlier. For nearly 50 years, Harold had convinced himself that silence protected the people he loved. Now that silence had become something else entirely. A weapon. Outside the courtroom, reporters crowded the hallway, trying to catch a glimpse of Daniel as he disappeared through a private exit with his legal team. But even surrounded by attorneys, he no longer looked controlled. He looked exhausted, cornered, and underneath the anger, something worse had started surfacing. Shame. 2 days later, the DNA results arrived. Judge Hayes reviewed them privately first, then closed the folder slowly. The results confirmed what everyone already feared. Daniel Bennett was not biologically related to Harold or Margaret Bennett. But another detail inside the report complicated everything further. No biological match connected Daniel to any surviving family records linked to St. Vincent Medical Center from that night in 1978, which meant one possibility became impossible to ignore. The real Bennett child may never have left the hospital alive. Judge Hayes reopened proceedings immediately. This time, the courtroom filled beyond capacity. People weren't coming for a legal hearing anymore. They were coming to witness answers. But the answers that emerged only deepened the tragedy. A former hospital administrator finally agreed to testify after receiving immunity protections connected to possible record fraud investigations. His testimony shook the courtroom. According to him, a medical emergency occurred shortly after midnight on the maternity floor the night Daniel was born. One newborn suffered respiratory failure. The situation became chaotic. Doctors panicked. A wealthy family connected to hospital donors threatened legal action after accusations of negligence began spreading internally. Records were altered to contain the fallout. The administrator admitted he never personally witnessed a deliberate baby switch. But he confirmed something equally disturbing. Certain infants were temporarily removed from official tracking records during the confusion. And afterward, administrators ordered staff silence. Judge Hayes asked the question everyone feared. Was the Bennett child among those unaccounted for? The former administrator lowered his eyes. We believe so. Harold closed his eyes immediately. The pain on his face became almost unbearable to watch. Because until that moment, part of him still believed his biological son might exist somewhere. Now that hope was disappearing. Meanwhile, Daniel sat completely still throughout the testimony. No interruptions. No anger. No objections. Just silence. The kind of silence that follows emotional exhaustion. Then Judge Hayes introduced Margaret's final handwritten journal entry into evidence. The courtroom clerk read it aloud. Margaret described spending years trapped between two impossible truths, loving Daniel as her son, and fearing the damage hidden beneath the secret. One line affected the room more than any other. I think the truth wounded him long before it wounded us. Daniel looked down immediately. For the first time since proceedings began, he appeared unable to hide emotion completely. The journal revealed even more. Margaret believed Daniel's obsession with control intensified after discovering the truth because he became terrified of losing identity itself. Not just money. Identity. If Harold and Margaret stopped being his parents emotionally, then who was he? That fear slowly transformed into resentment. And resentment transformed into manipulation. The audience finally began understanding the full emotional picture. Daniel loved them, hated them, depended on them, blamed them, feared abandonment, and feared becoming nobody, all at the same time. Then came the final revelation. One of Margaret's hidden investigator files contained evidence that Daniel secretly reviewed her cancer treatment records during her final year. Nothing proved he harmed her, but the investigator documented suspicious behavior, medication schedule changes, unauthorized pharmacy pickups, private meetings with doctors, altered legal paperwork during periods Margaret was heavily medicated. The implications were devastating. Not enough for criminal charges, but enough to permanently destroy trust. Harold looked physically sick hearing it, because deep down, he realized Margaret may have spent her final months afraid inside her own home. Judge Hayes eventually called Daniel back to the stand one last time. When he sat down, he no longer looked like the polished businessman from the beginning of the case. He looked older now, drained. Judge Hayes asked quietly, "Did you love Harold and Margaret Bennett?" Daniel answered immediately, "Yes." The courtroom remained silent. Then the judge asked the harder question, "Did you resent them for hiding the truth?" This time Daniel hesitated. His eyes moved toward Harold briefly, then away again. "Yes." Another silence followed. Then Judge Hayes asked the question that mattered most. "Did you attempt to gain control of Harold Bennett's estate because you feared losing your place in the family?" Daniel's expression finally broke. Not dramatically, not explosively, quietly, like someone too exhausted to continue pretending. "I spent my whole life becoming the person they wanted," he said softly. His voice sounded smaller now. "And the second I learned the truth, every memory changed." Harold's eyes filled slowly. Daniel continued, "I didn't know what was real anymore." For the first time in the entire case, Harold looked at Daniel not with fear, but grief. Because despite everything, despite the manipulation, despite the lies, Daniel had still been the child they raised. And maybe that made the tragedy even worse. Judge Hayes delivered her ruling near sunset. Daniel's petition for guardianship and property control was denied entirely. The court also recommended expanded investigation into St. Vincent Medical Center regarding historical record tampering and negligence concealment. But before ending proceedings, Judge Hayes spoke directly to both men. "Some truths arrive too late to heal anyone," she said quietly. The courtroom remained completely silent. She continued, "But silence has consequences too. And sometimes families spend so many years protecting themselves from pain that they accidentally create something even more destructive." No one celebrated the ruling. There was no victory waiting at the end of the story, only damage, and people trying to understand how long that damage had really existed. The city stopped talking about the Bennett case after a few weeks. Another scandal replaced it. Another headline. Another tragedy. But inside the Bennett family, nothing truly ended. Harold returned to the small house he had shared with Margaret for more than 40 years. For days, he barely touched anything. Margaret's coffee cup still sat near the kitchen sink. Her reading glasses remained folded beside the couch. One of her sweaters still hung near the hallway closet. The silence inside the house felt heavier now. Not peaceful, punishing. Because everywhere Harold looked, he saw reminders of the years they spent pretending the truth would somehow disappear if they loved hard enough. Some evenings, Harold sat alone inside the garage beside the old cabinet where Margaret hid the documents for decades. He would reread parts of her journal slowly, not searching for answers anymore, searching for moments he missed, warnings, fear, loneliness, and every time, the same realization returned. Margaret had not been protecting a secret. She had been trying to protect her family from collapsing under the weight of it. But eventually, secrets stop protecting people. Eventually, they begin changing them. Across the city, Daniel disappeared almost completely from public life. Several business partners quietly distanced themselves after details from the hearing became public. Charity boards removed his name from events. Interviews stopped. Calls slowed down. Inside his penthouse apartment, the silence waiting for him each night felt unfamiliar. For years, Daniel built his life around control. Financial control, emotional control, social control. But once the courtroom stripped away the image he spent decades constructing, he was left alone with the one thing he had spent his entire adult life avoiding: himself. One night, Daniel opened an old family photo album Margaret once kept hidden inside a bedroom drawer. Most of the photographs showed ordinary moments: birthdays, fishing trips, Christmas mornings, school graduations, Harold smiling proudly beside him, Margaret holding his face affectionately. Three people who genuinely looked like a family. And maybe they had been. That was the part Daniel could no longer understand. How something could feel real and still be built on something broken. Weeks later, Harold finally visited Margaret's grave alone. The cemetery sat quiet beneath gray afternoon skies, while distant wind moved through rows of trees. Harold placed fresh flowers beside the headstone carefully, then stood there longer than usual. At first, he said nothing. But eventually, the silence became too heavy. "I should have listened to you sooner," he whispered. His voice cracked slightly, not because of anger, because of regret. He regretted ignoring Margaret's fear, ignoring Daniel's emotional changes, ignoring his own instincts. Most of all, he regretted waiting until it was too late for any truth to save them. Meanwhile, Daniel sat alone inside his apartment staring at the city lights below. His phone buzzed once, then stopped. No family, no visitors, no calls from people who once crowded around his success. For the first time in years, there was nobody left to impress. Only memories, and questions he still couldn't answer. Was Harold ever truly his father? Was Margaret truly his mother? Or had they all simply spent decades performing versions of a family they desperately wanted to believe in? The emotional weight of those questions followed him everywhere now. Not loudly, quietly, like grief. Several months later, St. Vincent Medical Center officially reopened internal investigations connected to historical maternity ward record tampering. More former employees came forward anonymously. Families requested archive testing. Old lawsuits resurfaced. But none of it could restore what the Bennetts lost. Because the greatest damage had never existed inside the hospital. It lived inside silence. Inside fear. Inside avoidance. Inside years of pretending emotional wounds would heal on their own. One cold evening, Harold returned to the garage one final time, carrying Margaret's remaining documents. The photographs, the investigator notes, the tapes, the letters. He placed everything into a metal barrel behind the house, then slowly lit a match. The flames rose carefully at first before consuming decades of hidden truths. Harold watched quietly. Not because he wanted to erase the past, but because there was nothing left for the past to destroy. As the fire faded into ash, Harold looked up toward the darkening sky and finally allowed himself to cry openly. Not for the missing child, not for the courtroom, not even for Margaret. He cried for the family they might have been if fear had not shaped every decision they made. And somewhere across the city, Daniel sat alone holding an old photograph of himself as a little boy standing between Harold and Margaret in front of a cheap birthday cake. All three of them smiling. All three believing something simple. That love alone could keep a family together. Sometimes it can. Sometimes it cannot. And sometimes the stranger inside a family is not the person who arrived from somewhere else. Sometimes it is the truth nobody was willing to face. If this story made you think, you can check the screen now and watch our next video, or explore more stories like this on Chaos of Lives.